Welcome to the Great Shrimp Shoal. Today we're going to go over the last preparations I'm putting together for the new tank that I'm setting up to house a community of ghost shrimp. It's not your normal design by far. It's got some really interesting ideas. Anyway, let's get things started right away. So I have dove in and fully resolved to use cement as the centerpiece for my next aquarium. It was a big deal and I'm still in the thick of it right now, but we'll get to that soon enough. First, we have my bamboo shrimp, which are doing really well with the new filter components installed. Overall, the filter throughput is back up to normal and that makes the bamboo shrimp really happy. They rely on feeding out of the water that flows around the tank, so they use their fans to pull in food particles, and that may be small micro and nano crustaceans or floating biomatter like algae or waterborne detritus. They do this all day long and most of the night. In fact, I can just about turn the lights on at any time and they're still in the grind of eating wherever they can find. Obviously, a filtered tank is not an ideal environment for them. To be honest, they'd probably be a little bit more at home in a tank with a salinity closer to the water in a delta, and they wouldn't care if it was cloudy at all. Either way, I'm happy that the bamboo shrimp are looking more active, and that they're enjoying their tank once more. After all, this is pretty much theirs to take over. On to Phase 2 for Shrimp Tank 3. So I have everything besides the stock assembled for the new shrimp tank. It's been fun coming up with new ideas, especially after more than a year of keeping different kinds of shrimp. I have settled on to what shrimp to put into it, but I'm still working out the decorative and planted elements. Out of all these elements, there is one that eludes me to this moment. Out of all these things, the most important and troublesome decoration is this centerpiece, which I have planned to make out of cement. It was going to pull triple duty as a planter, centerpiece, and a feeding surface for the shrimp. I wanted a planter in this tank because I was going to toss out the bulk of the substrate and use only a groove down the center of the planter to plant plants. This would clear the way for lighter colored sand at the bottom of the tank, so that darker shrimp would pop against the background. It was basically a test. All of this was to highlight green, brown, or other natural shrimp colors. I was chasing this aesthetic because so much of what we use in planted tanks while keeping shrimp is green, brown, black, or dark in color. Simply put, some of the nicest and most hardy shrimp get lost in a traditional planted tank. I want to get one thing out of the way right away. I don't know how this is going to go. I don't really know if cement will have any long-term adverse effects on the shrimp. Cement or concrete is an aggregate that contains a few different substances, including some fine powders. In ideal situations, these different materials will become suspended and solidified in a proper application. But who am I to say that no particulates will leak from the final form? What if the materials change the water parameters? I have some encouragement in the fact that people have used cement to build planters and water features for fish before, so it should be all right. We'll have to see how the ghost shrimp fare once they're added to the tank after a few weeks. So I started off by creating a form from used wood that I had laying around. I put it all together with some needlessly large screws and then lined the inside and bottom with some corrugated plastic to form up the base and the sides. Once I had that form ready, I created a groove using some wood stacked on top of each other. Overall, I placed a plastic sheet to aid in removing the concrete once it was set. The groove would be in the center top of the inverted form, so I will hopefully have an ideal place to plant hairgrass, rotala, or a few crypts, or whatever else I decide to eventually put into the tank. The first casting went well, but something was off with the consistency of the first pour, and a second pour covered up my mistakes so that I wasn't aware of it until I dumped out the form. The result of using a quick-setting concrete meant that my pour mixing skills left pockets of dry powder and air still trapped at the bottom of the form. It would have been fine if not for the fact that it drastically affected the strength of the final decoration once it was turned out. When I took it out of the form, it cracked immediately in a very predictable place where most of the air pockets had formed, and there was still a powder-like consistency to the concrete. I figured that this would be a bust, as it wouldn't sit well in the tank and I'd have to rinse it a ton of times to get all of the remaining dust out of the form. It also didn't create an ideal planter. I wanted to be able to remove and clean everything if I needed to. It wasn't too heavy either, so it served as a good first test. I immediately reworked my idea and got a strengthened concrete mixture that included synthetic fibers that were distributed throughout. This strengthened mix was crack resistant and didn't require the use of metal supportive structures inside the form. However, the inclusion of these fibers was just another added thing that made me worried about what I was eventually going to put into a tank with living, breathing, eating animals that basically forage for their food off of the tank floor. But more on that later. The mixing and the pouring of the crack-resistant concrete went much better this time, and I spent a good deal of time with my hands in the form, moving parts around to even the mixture out. One 50-pound bag of mix was going to produce a roughly 50-pound block of solid formed concrete, so this isn't going to be as light as a piece of paper, obviously. It's really interesting to note the weight of water which this form will be replacing in the 20-gallon tank that it's going to be put into. 20 gallons of water weighs 166 pounds according to Google, and that is truly mind-blowing to know that your 20-gallon tank weighs about as much as a full-grown man. So this 50-pound little decoration is kind of a drop in the bucket. Yes, it's about 1/3 of the weight, but it takes about 1/3 of the volume, so it's pretty comparable to decorating the tank with nothing. A day later and the mix was solidified, and I continued to cure the surface with sprinkles of water. A few days after that, it was much more solid, and I think it was now ready to be turned over and see what we've created after 2 tries and a week's worth of solid work. Here, the result is after I uncovered it from the wrap and put the plastic sheeting off. Not too shabby if I say so myself. It should do well. This pillow-like decoration provides more than 2 inches of substrate room to grow roots for rooted plants in the trough. It also provides a central focus point for the shrimp and plants to coexist in. The most important part is that it is a planter, and it really keeps the plants in check, so I can plant something voracious like the rotala, and I don't have to worry about it taking over the tank within a month. I can also clean and safely remove the rest of the substrate in the tank without disturbing the plants, and I can remove the plants and replant it without disturbing the substrate and the shrimp. And it all prevents kicking up material that I'd like to ultimately keep down on the substrate. I have roughed up the surface of the form a little bit with a hammer and chisel in order to try and get some of the plastic off that's caught in the cracks, and it kind of gives the entire form a little bit of a hammered together look. I blasted it with water and tried to rinse it really well before putting it into the tank. Ultimately, I'll need to let it sit in the water over the next couple of weeks so that a biofilm begins to form on the sand, concrete, and the substrate. Once that is done, I should test the water a few times before attempting to add the shrimp. The reason that I'm being so careful is that invertebrates, while hardy for the most part, are also some of the easiest creatures to hurt with what would be benign chemicals and materials for other fish. So, just a little bit of copper can kill your shrimp and snails. I'd hate to find out that the concrete had something similar in it. Ultimately, I will have to give it some time before I figure that out, as it will take a while to see how the ghost shrimp take to their new surroundings. So, after things looked good and solid with the cement structure, I spent the rest of the week moving my tanks and cleaning in preparation for the new addition. I wanted to get the 20-gallon tank up and running quickly so that I could get the water cycled as soon as possible. I had rinsed out the tank and added the sand, added the decorative planter, and then let the water run through the reverse osmosis system to fill out the water properly. It was interesting to note that the water was already medium hard when measured in the tank after filling. It clocked in at a TDS of around 120. To put that into perspective, when measuring the water from the filter usually, it is near to a 0 dissolved solids. For the rest of my tanks, it may be time to replace the DI resin in the filter, or one of the other filter components. For this tank, I don't think it'll be too much of an issue. Ghost shrimp are able to deal with a bit more hard water, because most species of this type are typically found in the reeds and grasses of intertidal areas. I'm using my standard Caridina salts to condition the water for the ghost shrimp in the event that the water was too soft. They usually do well together anyway with the Caridina shrimp, with only some minor differences. My only worry is that the sand that I'm using, or the cement, is actually leaving some undesirable dissolved minerals in the water that will cause some problems later on. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. So that is the basic setup of this new tank. I still have to add the planting substrate, which should lower the pH and provide a good place for beneficial bacteria. Adding plants will help that process along too. I'm interested in measuring the water parameters after a couple of days letting it sit, because it might just be the turbidity that's causing the pH and TDS to be so high. Overall, I think this new design is pretty interesting, but it will take a while to get used to, at least visually. Right now it does present a pretty monolithic form. This isn't really for me though. It's for the shrimp after all, so if they take to it despite its visual shortcomings, then I will have no complaints. That reminds me, I still have yet to source the shrimp for this tank. How many ghost shrimp and of what variety is yet to be determined, but I will include that decision-making process in one of my next videos. For now, I'm all out of steam, and it's time to wrap things up. Thank you for showing up, and don't forget to subscribe on your way out, as it will really help me grow the channel. As always, I hope that you have some sweet shrimpy dreams before we meet next. Good night.